A very good afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on from where you are joining us. My name is Bastian Gigerich. I am the Director for Defense and Military Analysis at the IISS. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's launch of a new publication, Russia's Military Modernization and Assessment. It appears in the IISS Strategic Dossier Series. And I have with me here some of the contributors to this work who will take you through some of the key findings across, give you a bit of an overview, then take you across different areas, strategic forces, different domains, and also speak about the defense economic piece in this particular puzzle. This is a publication that results from a research project that the IISS has conducted over the last 2 to 3 years, which included a number of expert workshops. It included a number of visits, country visits. It included interaction with a number of experts internationally, and the result is about 190 pages or so of facts and analysis that we hope is helpful to all of you. So what we will do is I will invite my colleagues to give you in short bursts overviews of key areas in the strategic dossier that will take a good half hour or so, perhaps a little bit longer, to walk you through the main elements of that. And then we have hopefully plenty of time for discussion. Once the presentation is done, we will remind you how you can ask your questions, make your comments. The Zoom professionals on this call will know that there is a chat function that they can use, but also that electronic blue hand that they can raise, which will get our attention, and then we will be able to call on you to ask your questions. So with that out of the way, I will hand over to James Hackett, editor of the Military Balance and senior fellow for Defense and Military Analysis, who will kick us off. James, over to you.
Thank you, Bastian. Russia's armed forces are transformed from the Soviet-era formations that began the 1990s. But before we talk in detail, as Bastian trailed then about service developments in detail, it's worth discussing how we got to here. While our book focuses on the reforms after 2008, the reforms that led to the forces we see today, it can be said that Russia is finally moving towards generating military formations of the type that were at least part envisaged by Russian military theoreticians as far back as the early 1980s. That is a military establishment with a streamlined command structure and more mobile and better trained forces. There were reform attempts during the 1990s, but it proved impossible then to deliver on these ambitions. One reason was that funding collapsed in that decade. Another was that there wasn't enough high-level political attention. But relatively poor military performance in the wars in Chechnya and in Georgia highlighted problems with the command and control structure and with equipment and personnel, with Russia's high command judging that not enough units were deemed combat ready. The exposure of military shortcomings raised questions about the armed forces' ability to address the challenges of modern warfare, particularly in the types of conflicts that it was thought might break out on Russia's periphery. Higher level political attention in time, coupled with more funding, converged to kickstart the reform process. Can we have the next slide, please, Bastian? However, this process hasn't been uniformly smooth. Initial reform attempts intended to improve on the Soviet-era command and control structure, which was originally designed to support the mass mobilization process, were judged suboptimal and were, after 2010, adjusted to today's structure of a reduced number of military districts, as well as joint strategic commands. A key change was that the military district commander would control all forces within the district, bar those subordinated to higher commands like the airborne forces and the strategic rocket forces. Could we have the next slide, please, Bastian? The New Look reforms introduced after 2008, or towards the end of 2008, they're first launched, were entrusted to the civilian team under Anatoly Serdyukov. They ushered in significant transformation. Change to command and control was one, but so was change to force structure. Brigades were to be a key unit of action for the ground forces, and air armies, divisions, and regiments were replaced with the airbase or avia bassa concept. Personnel numbers, particularly in the officer ranks, such as in the units designed to accept mobilized reservists in time of crisis or war, were to be significantly reduced. However, key aspects of the post-2008 reforms, such as those that reshaped the ground forces and air force structure and moves to outsource some rear support functions, were subsequently adjusted. Indeed, an important characteristic of the reform process has been Russia's willingness to test and adjust its reforms and change these when they're deemed suboptimal. Sergei Shoigu, Serdyukov's successor as defense minister, has presided over many of these adjustments. Under Shoigu, the army has again been restructured, while the aerospace forces' airbase approach was scrapped. Indeed, perhaps the most important legacy of the Serdyukov reforms has been the idea that combat-ready armed forces should be held at a state of high readiness. This has been bolstered under Shoigu and has been increased investment in training. Furthermore, Shoigu introduced ambitious plans to modernize equipment inventories. After 2014, there was further change, with the armed forces reorienting to the possibility of participation in large-scale conventional war. Command and control has seen renewed attention, such as with the creation of the National Defense Management Center and the introduction of more advanced command and control systems throughout the armed forces, while divisional level formations in the army have been recreated. Moreover, participation in conflict in Ukraine and Syria has led to lessons for military organization as well as equipment. But overall, the military reform process after 2008 has meant that Russia has finally moved away from the old mass mobilization system. Its armed forces today comprise smaller formations with an increasing professional core that are better equipped than their predecessors. And headlines perhaps after this just over 10-year period of the military reform process has been that within the army, a permanent combat-ready professional corps has been created. Military hardware is being renewed. There's been significant improvements to combat training. Command and control improvements have been implemented at many levels. The armed forces have gained limited but still useful combat experience, and power projection capabilities have increased. With that, I'll hand over to Henry to talk about the strategic forces.
Thank you, James. Starting with the strategic forces, because despite wider military modernization efforts, the nuclear forces remain central to Russian strategic doctrine. If you look at the map on screen, you can see that their overall layout is roughly familiar to where it was 10 years ago at the start of the last strategic armament program. They were at a better starting point to this process than the conventional forces were, having been relatively protected during the last decade. I stress the word relatively because even they have forced to make tough choices in terms of their prioritization and budgetary. Nonetheless, all three legs of the triad have seen largely, if not completely, successful modernization efforts under the 2020 State Armament Program. See from the next slide, the Strategic Rocket Force, and thereby the land-based component, remains the dominant leg of the triad. Though even here you can see a sort of stark divergence. The road mobile ICBM force has almost completed its shift from old school Topol to the more modernized Topol Air, more Yars designs in the last decade. However, they have two other designs, the shorter range Rubezh missile, believed to be a two-stage Yars, and the rail mobile Barguzin, both ended up being put into stasis through a combination of budget or technical issues. Meanwhile, the silo-based force has shrunk dramatically. This reflects Russian concerns both about the increasing vulnerability of their silo-based forces, but also delays through budget and technical issues to the successor Sarmat silo-based ICBM, which will eventually be expected to carry the Avangard hypersonic boost glide vehicle. In the Navy, the anticipated Bore SSBN Bulava SLBM combination also suffered from delays, and at one point it was questionable whether the project would even proceed. However, they have now successfully entered into service and are now comprised more than a third of Russia's active SSBN fleet. As a result, the aging Delta III Kalmar class hulls are now being retired, with one left in the Pacific at the moment. Meanwhile, Delphin Delta IVs upgraded their Sneva SLBMs to a modified liner design, which allows them to remain relevant in this field and sustain the overall size of the SSBN fleet, a slight decline on where they were in 2007, but still reasonable numbers. Meanwhile, the Air Force has introduced the long-range Ka-102 nuclear cruise missile, the nuclear counterpart to the conventional Ka-101 cruise missile used in Syria, in order to sustain their capability in the medium term. However, whilst overall bomber numbers remain comparable to the pre-SAP fleet, only a third of them have now been modernized to carry Ka-102. So perhaps the truly cutting edge of Russia's air edge of the triad is smaller than it necessarily appears. This numerical decline in launch numbers reflects a combination of budgetary and technical issues across all three legs, for even this most protected of capabilities in the Russian military, rather than necessarily a loss of importance. And I think the continuing importance of the nuclear mission, coupled with concerns about missile defense developments, is better underscored by Russia's renewed investment in novel delivery systems, such as the aforementioned Avangard HGV, the Rovesnik cruise missile, and the Poseidon autonomous torpedo. It's interesting, I think, to contrast where the strategic forces have got to, where while modernization may not have delivered almost everything they wanted, they at least got a sizable portion of new equipment. I think the phrase didn't get what they want, but maybe got what they need, perhaps echoes throughout this dossier. And contrast the strategic forces efforts with what happened in the land domain, and start from the next slide. As James touched upon earlier in looking at the new look, and preceding efforts in Russia, that the Russian ground forces came to the conclusion that their conscript personnel were really perhaps more of a liability than an asset in the wars they fought in the 1990s, particularly in Chechnya. And there's been a long-held ambition to shift from the conscript-based force to a professional contract service basis for their personnel. They finally achieved some serious progress in this area after 2012, which in 2012, I think the ratio was one contract personnel to every two conscripts. By 2020, that ratio is now reversed, and Russia can now field just over 400,000 contract service personnel to a little over 200,000 conscript personnel across the armed forces. These figures, however, are still below the targets they had aimed to hit at the start of this decade. They've twice had to both postpone and revise the overall target, and this sort of halfway house between a kind of a reasonably capable number of contract personnel, but still less than they wanted, I think influences a lot of what they think about in terms of organizational structure. As James mentioned, a new look envisaged moving to a kind of a brigade-based, fully contract staffed force. This turns out to be unachievable. They don't have the contract personnel to do all of that. So instead, they're focused on reviving an idea of battalion tactical groups where they can fill these formations with 100% with contract personnel, and this has formed their basis, their operations in Ukraine. With larger scale operations coming back into vogue, Russia having been focused primarily on local operations against kind of regional states up until this point, a return from the purely brigade-based force to a Soviet-style division structure with improved command and control and also improved support and sustain capabilities has come back into focus. And again, you can see what that means across the Ukraine and Belarus borders as the three motor rifle divisions re-established post-2014 begin to flesh out. It's unclear whether these divisions are intended eventually to deploy light, i.e. only with their contract personnel, or to be reinforced with additional contract personnel to full strength by drawing on non-deploying formations from elsewhere in Russia should the occasion arise. But broadly speaking now, the Russians now have plausible structures for deploying ground combat capability, both for local wars and for more high-intensity peer-on-peer competition. This, however, leaves the equipment side of the angle, and for that I will hand you back to James to take you through the heavy metal side of land force reorganization.
Thanks very much, Henry. This slide that you see in front of you illustrates the change in selected aspects of the ground forces and airborne and coastal forces inventory since 2007. Overall, it's readily apparent from this slide that numbers have reduced significantly, and older equipment has flowed out of frontline units, notably for tanks, T-55, T-62 and T-64. The 2020 State Armament Programme, which was agreed towards the end of 2010, initially envisaged an ambitious overhaul of land combat equipment. But the ground forces in 2020 are behind the other services in terms of the proportion of modern platforms in service, partly a result of the large number of legacy APCs and IFVs in service, also partly because of the modernization plans that were envisaged for the other services and the relative prioritization that these were given. But while there are plans to bring into service new generation equipment, and the public focus under the 2020 State Armament Programme, or SAP, was on new generation equipment such as the Armata family, Kurganets and Boomerang, these couldn't be delivered in the required time frame. For instance, for the tank fleet, variants of the T-72 will form the mainstay of Russian armor forces into the 2030s, while modernized variants of the BTR and BMP series have also been introduced. Appreciation of the potential for high-intensity ground combat and the need for adequate vehicle numbers to equip units will, when combined with the cost and development timelines for these new platforms, likely drive yet more upgrades to legacy equipment. Indeed, as well as modernization of older platforms like T-72s, some Russian analysts suggest a second set of intermediate improvements, including to BMP-3s, T-90Ms, and the improved artillery systems that are coming in line now. Perhaps by doing so, then bridging the gap until the next generation of vehicles, possibly including more uninhabited and robotic systems, finally emerges. If we could move to the next slide, please, Bastian. When seen in 2015, Armata platforms like the T-14 main battle tank design seen here on the slide in front of you seem to promise a step change in armor system capabilities. But development delays have meant the program has been pushed into the next state armament program. When it is introduced, of course, it will bring a significant capability increase for those forces that have the vehicle, given its emphasis on crew protection and also active protection systems that can be seen from at least the prototypes that have been seen at parades, etc. There's been discussion about whether the Armata platforms might actually change the way Russian armor and infantry interacted on the battlefield, increasing protection and mobility for embarked infantry, as well as delivering greater supporting firepower. But although it's been reported that the first deliveries of T-14 will be to the 2nd Motor Rifle Division, it remains unclear whether these and other Armata vehicles are intended to be concentrated in this or certain other units, or distributed more widely, or used in combination with other assets, or whether they, certainly the tanks, might be employed for certain tasks or in specific roles, such as an armored vanguard, given their high level of protection. For Russia's defense industry, meanwhile, the Armata platform's derivatives might offer more streamlined production and maintenance opportunities. For instance, one area of commonality that has been highlighted by some analysts relates to the turret ring size on some of the supporting Armata systems, which could improve commonality and therefore perhaps industrial efficiency. Similar to the tank fleet, Russia's artillery modernization under SAP 2020 was publicly focused on new generation equipment. But delays have also been seen to the new generation Koalitsiya SV 152mm self-propelled gun, and it's possible here that Russia is also pursuing a dual strategy in artillery modernization, developing Koalitsiya while modernizing existing equipment. Tactical considerations have led Russia to also focus on modernizing older heavy artillery systems, such as the 2S7, which is being modernized as the 2S7M, as well as the 2S4 240mm self-propelled mortar. Lessons from Syria and Ukraine, notably in relation to engagements against fortified positions and the requirement for heavier supporting firepower, have likely informed such choices, as have financial factors. Using such systems might just be more cost-effective than employing missile systems. But if there's been only modest progress in recapitalizing armored fighting vehicles and self-propelled artillery, I think there has been greater focus, and the book discusses this, in modernizing the rocket and missile artillery infantry. Can we move to the next slide, please, Bastian? Russia has recently completed replacing its Tochka-U units with Iskander. This has served to greatly increase the strike range of Russia's ground forces. Tochka-U has a range of about 120 kilometers and Iskander at least 500 kilometers. And Iskander is reported to have aeroballistic missile and cruise missile variants. Similar improvements are being seen in relation to MRL systems, where Russia is looking to replace older models like Grad and Smerch with the Tornado system. That's not leading to significant range improvements, rather improvements to the missile and warheads. Also, Russia has put a lot of effort into improving cooperation between units and refining the ability to find, fix, and strike high-value targets. Modernization of reconnaissance capabilities continues to detect and monitor targets in real time and to reduce the time between the detection of a target and its engagement by artillery, aircraft, or precision weapons. Also, there's focus on integration of UAVs for targeting and battle damage assessment, and it's likely that Russia will continue to further integrate UAVs with ground forces for reconnaissance and artillery purposes, but perhaps also for them to serve in future as a vehicle to deliver other capabilities, perhaps like including electronic attack. Overall, armour and artillery modernisation, together with the moves to improve command and control, organisation and deployability, and the exercises that take place to test these, indicate that the ability to generate forces able to conduct high-tempo manoeuvre operations remains an aspiration for the Russian ground forces. And with that, I'll hand over to, I believe, Nick Childs to talk about maritime issues.
Thank you, James. From the perspective of naval forces, perhaps one of the key transformations in naval terms has been the adoption of a long-range precision land attack cruise missile capability through the Kalibr family of missiles. Compared to the Nadia of the early 2000s and the Kursk disaster, the injection of significant added resources has led to a sort of new model Russian Navy within certain limits. The new capabilities have been vested across a range of platforms, but mainly in submarines and a new generation of missile-equipped small and medium surface combatants. The result has been the development of a fairly potent, predominantly near seas, mainly green water naval capability. Blue water power projection capabilities remain vested chiefly in, again, submarines and aging Soviet-era legacy platforms. This has been well short of declared ambitions. Also, the calibrization of the fleet itself needs to be calibrated in terms of total capacity, so far delivered. Having said that, Moscow may be adjusting to this new reality. Next slide, please. Part of the shortfall up to now has been down to the slow delivery times of even prestige submarine programs. And we heard earlier from Henry about the difficult birth for the current SSBN program. This has been due to the weak industrial base and compounded in the case of certain programs by the imposition of sanctions. Previous plans envisaged the commissioning by this year of 8 of the new Bory class ballistic missile submarines, or SSBNs, and a similar number of Yasen-M cruise missile armed submarines. But up to now, the actual numbers are 4 and 1, but this is dynamic and I think will evolve significantly. It's a similar story for other programs, including for new blue water surface combatants and amphibious shipping. There has been a partial bright spot with conventionally powered submarine deliveries. The silver linings are also that in some areas, construction performance has been improving somewhat. More significantly, there is now something of a bow wave of delayed construction in the pipeline that should see significant further capability improvements during this decade. This may well be felt most particularly on the submarines front, with the crown jewels of a largely recapitalized SSBN fleet. You could argue ahead of roughly equivalent Western programs at the moment, and a potent flotilla of new cruise missile armed submarines. Otherwise, in terms of platforms, the developments are likely going to be incremental. There seems to be neither the capacity nor the resources to go much further in terms particularly of the almost mythical programs for blue water capabilities like the new class of nuclear-powered super destroyers or cruisers of the leader class. Nevertheless, one potential step change from the middle of the decade could be in systems and the advent in particular of new hypersonic capabilities. That at least is the plan. Key questions are over whether this can be sustained and the extent to which this might also spill over to some extent in a partial rejuvenation of blue water power projection capabilities. Again, there looks set to be incremental change, more capability, but possibly with fewer platforms. This change is likely to be centered on the Admiral Gorshkov class of surface combatants, the only really blue water capability to have been introduced in this category in recent years, and their probable derivatives. There is, of course, the aircraft carrier question. earlier talk of a few years ago of 5 to 6 new aircraft carriers may look like fantasy fleet stuff now. There is a question mark over whether the current Admiral Kuznetsov will ever go to sea again operationally. There does still seem to be a carrier aspiration. The progress of the new large amphibious ships recently laid down could be an important pointer. They could signal how practical it would be to build a new aircraft carrier and the capability associated with that in the 2030s. Or they could turn out to be a more modest and perhaps more cost-effective power projection substitute to a new full-blown carrier capability. The limits of achievable modernization may not deliver a truly global navy. They could deliver further enhanced regional capability as well as some boost to global reach. With that, I'll turn over to my aerospace counterpart, Douglas Barry.
Thank you, Nick. There we go. Sorry about that. I'm now speaking. Thanks, Nick. Good day, everyone. My name's Douglas Barry. I'm Senior Fellow for Military Aerospace at the Institute. You know, whether Stalin or Lenin actually ever ushered the phrase, you know, quantity has a quality all of its own, it was certainly true for the Soviet-era Air Force. By the late 1980s, you're looking at an Air Force and an Air Defence Force, which together have over 4,500 tactical combat aircraft. By the early 20s, 2007, Russia's Air Force is, around a third of this number now, about 1,600 or so. And by this year, the Air Force, within the aerospace forces, you're down to just over 800. So you're looking at a fleet which is about a fifth of the size. One of the key differences, of course, is the late 1980s fleet is predominantly single type, single role. By now, you've got a fleet which is predominantly multi-role in the tactical sense. But it was more quality rather than quantity that was the pressing issue as the first decade of this century progressed. The Air Force was in a comparatively poor state, both in terms of the platforms, which were aging, and air crews just weren't getting enough training. The weapons were also becoming obsolescent. By 2020, this has changed and changed significantly. At least in the Russians' own terms, the tactical aircraft fleet was predominantly modern. The service was also benefiting from combat experience in Syria. So the aerospace forces of 2020 are far more capable of combat in a peer competitive environment than they've really been since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Next slide, please, Bastian. The Soviets had a very clear roadmap for where they wanted to take the Air Force from the late 1980s through to the beginning of this century. The problem was, of course, that it was shredded by the economic turmoil of the 1990s. They were unable to deliver it. In fact, they were pretty much on their knees in terms of service capability from really throughout the 1990s into the start of this century. This obviously is all turned around by the new reform programme, which a couple of my colleagues have already spoken about, and also the associated increase in procurement funding. These two together were key. As James has previously mentioned, not all of the new look reforms were successful for the Air Force. Particularly the Avia Basa airbase approach, which proved very, very difficult for them to one, implement and two, sustain. And in fact, that's pretty much been abandoned. But it kind of shows a test and adjust approach, which has obviously merits. Also, the re-equipment ambitions haven't been fully delivered by any stretch of the imagination. The 2015 State Armament Programme couldn't be met. The funding was there or thereabouts, but the industrial capacity wasn't. The 2020 State Armament Programme, by comparison, was actually the one that's delivered. Goals have been met mostly, but again, in a kind of test and adjust approach, where some of the higher aims couldn't actually be met. I think significantly, the re-equipment programme, pretty much certainly within the Aerospace Forces, and I think effectively across the board in most of the services, they've had to rely on Soviet-era designs and plans, and I think this is a critical issue for them, which will play out in this decade. Irrespective of this, putting that to one side, the Aerospace Forces have a far greater combat capability today. Next slide, Bastian. Now, kind of alongside this, in terms of the platform development, you obviously need modern air-to-air and air-to-surface weapons. And in this field, again, the Air Force, the Aerospace Forces languished pretty much throughout the 1990s. And for most of the first decade of this century, they just didn't get what they needed. The roadmap, as I say, had been shredded. This has now changed. We've seen modern systems deployed in Syria, and again, in an air-to-air sense, much more capable. Some of the systems are 2 decades effectively late in entering service, but they at least now have them. The priority is bolster the inventory in terms of stock numbers, and also to introduce a variety of new air-to-surface, tactical air-to-surface systems. That's the other priority. Next slide, Bastian. Now, as I mentioned previously, the modernisation programme as currently in place has been built around projects for the most part were visible in the 1980s. The most obvious is how the Su-27 flanker design has been upgraded and reused. Worth keeping in mind that that programme actually began in 1969 and the first prototype was flown in 1977. Developing a next generation tactical combat aircraft remains a work in progress. Moscow's first 5th generation fighter project, which was led by Mikoyan, was cancelled no later than 1997. And the successor project, the Su-57 Felon, is, at least by Russia's own overly ambitious aims, about a decade behind schedule. That said, the Su-30SM, the Su-35S and the Su-34 provide aerospace forces with a credible set of combat aircraft for well into the 2030s, and they're continuing to go back to those platforms with additional orders for the Su-35 and an upgraded development of the Su-34 fullback coming down the pipe. Personnel, platform and weapons combat, combat tested in Syria, a real boost. In terms of, I suppose, a single takeaway from this decade for the Air Force, as with the other services, it's the need to shift to a new generation of platforms and weapons. In the Air Force, this is obviously the Su-57 Felon at the tactical level, the new build Tu-160 Blackjack, and also whether or not they can actually push through on a new bomber programme, which we'll all be looking at very carefully. And with that, I'll hand over to Fenella for the defence economics.
Thanks, Douglas, and good afternoon, everybody. For those I've not yet met, I'm the Senior Fellow for Defence Economics at the Institute, and the final chapter of the dossier examines Russian defence economics and industry developments. So to take us through some of the recent defence budget trends now, the dossier does look a bit further back to the post-Cold War era and identifies 4 distinct periods of defence spending shifts since 1992. So the first, which is again before this chart begins, is in the years immediately following the end of communism, and we saw a sharp decline in expenditure and a distinct decline of capability due to severe underinvestment in that period. The second period, during the 2000s, saw the beginning of a recovery, although procurement goals remained out of reach, and the tail end of this period you can see 2008 and 2009 here on the chart. The third period, which is perhaps the most interesting in terms of this dossier, we saw that significant build-up in defence investment, so that by 2015, the defence budget was 150% higher than in 2010 in nominal terms, which equates to around 60% in real terms. And that growth did enable Moscow to achieve several procurement targets, modernisation targets, as my colleagues have discussed. So during the fourth period since 2016-2017, the aim has really been to sustain this progress, particularly in the face of tremendous economic headwinds. So Russian defence spending has been quite stagnant, certainly in real terms, since 2017. We had sanctions impacting public finances and subdued energy revenues, and as modernisation ambitions got closer to fulfillment, you then therefore have economic, political and strategic drivers all weakening at the same time. So putting further pressure on defence investment, that is procurement and R&D, within the defence budget was the decision to index military pay, which increased the spending on personnel in 2018, 19 and 20. So even if this indexation does not continue, maintaining personnel and pension spending at that new higher level, while the top line is constrained, will squeeze other budget lines going forward. So in terms of the general outlook now, the forecast that you can see here is from the new budget forecast tool on Military Balance Plus, if you have access. And even before the pandemic and the consequent contraction in economic output emerged, the outlook for Russian defense spending was already quite subdued in light of persistently low oil prices in recent years. We also saw the oil price fall to below $20 a barrel in April this year, and the projected average price is just around $40 a barrel for the year. And that consequently led the IMF to forecast a 6.6% contraction in Russian real GDP this year, as lockdown measures to prevent the spread of COVID-19 subdued domestic and international economic activity, the latter of which would further weaken global energy demand, as we all know. So the IMF then project a 4.1% expansion in 2021, far lower than the 6.6% contraction this year. So that means that the Russian economy will only return to pre-COVID output in 2022. So in light of this bleaker fiscal setting, in July, the Russian Ministry of Finance proposed a 5% reduction in financing for the state armament program over the next 3 years. And we did have more positive budget projections for 21 and 22, but that was proposed at the tail end of 2019, so well before the full economic consequences of the pandemic were realised. The dossier does go into detail about the evolution of the state defence order in as much as possible, and the state armament programme over the last 20 years, so it's a really good tool for that. The Russian companies are now therefore facing a tighter domestic market, but also of concern is the burden of industry debt, which could serve to stifle further investment in new technologies and R&D. And that therefore creates further pressure on these companies who are facing political pressure to domestically to diversify production efforts towards the civil market. The reported moves to restructure industry debt may ease some of the stress on companies, providing some temporary bandwidth. But such moves then, that have to be priced from somewhere, so that could further constrain domestic defence spending as funds to absolve the debt further squeeze investment elsewhere. Next slide, please, Bastian. So the previous state armament programme to 2020, we saw that significant increases enacted to defence investment due to the ambitious modernisation targets, as we've looked into. So we saw spending peak in 2015. And as spending has moderated and faltered, so too has Russia's placement in global tables, falling from 4th in the peak 2015 year down to 6th in 2018, where it remained in 2019. So these figures are in constant 2015 dollars. They've been rebased and adjusted for inflation, and the relative utility of using market exchange rates as against PPP rates we do discuss in the dossier, and I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A section if anyone is interested in discussing further. the other point to note here is that this is total Russian defense expenditure. The previous chart reflected the core budget. And that's because in order to really compare Russian spending with that of global markets, you have to consider wider military spending items, so pensions, social support, military housing, and they're all found in other areas of the Russian budget. And it's again detailed in the dossier. So total defense expenditure is approximately 1.2 trillion rubles or $13 billion higher than the core budget. So consequently, if you look at it as a proportion of GDP, going back to that 2015 budget, the official budget would have accounted for 3.8% of GDP. But if you include these wider defense spending items, the total expenditure can increase to as much as 4.8% of GDP. So a whole percent of GDP higher. Next slide, please. So that brings me on to the issue of transparency. So the Russian budget isn't great. There's a high proportion of the national budget is classified, and that proportion, as we've catalogued here, has increased over time. Slightly better in recent years, but far higher than it was in previous years. So classified elements of the budget include weapons acquisition, the repair and modernization of existing equipment, and military R&D. So that's largely the funding that's included in the state defense order. Much of the spending aimed at supporting defense industry is also shielded from scrutiny. That includes funding in May 2016 that was to sustain industry development at a time when industry was severely constrained. So while we do know, even in light of this sort of lack of transparency, we do know there was a period of significant investment in the first half of the last decade. And that did help to recover some of the lost ground in the previous 2 decades, again, as my colleagues have described. And again, we do have the recent announcements that modernization goals have been close to achievement. So progress is fairly sort of remarkable on that front, but as my colleagues described, it's by no means comprehensive. So that's just a snapshot of the Defence Economics and Industry chapter. There's a great deal more detail in the dossier, a closer look at classified spending, the State Defence Order modernisation targets, and the overall environment that Russia's defence industry is operating in. So with that, I shall pass back to Bastian to open the floor to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, James, Henry, Nick, Douglas, and Fenella for taking us through these elements of the dossier. We now have time for discussion and conversation. There are 2 ways in which you can do that. As you can now see here on the screen, you can use the chat function, and I already encourage my colleagues to have a look at the things that are beginning to come in via the chat. And you can also use the raise hand function, which will alert us, and me in particular, that you wish to ask a question, and then our technical support team here will activate your microphone so that you can pose your question live, as it were, to us. So if I can encourage you to make good use of those 2 functions, so either raise hand or ask questions in the chat, we can get going. And the first question I'd like to pick up is from François Eisbourg in France, and he asks what has been the rationale for moving back to the division structure. As we mentioned, that has been a bit of back and forth on that, and so I'll ask Henry and James to perhaps speak on that a little bit. Henry, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Bastian. Francois, I think you touched upon it slightly in your point. One thing to consider is how representative do we think Syria is of the kind of operations Russia is structuring for and conducting, that the capabilities useful there are not necessarily the exact capabilities or structures they would want in other operations. And I think you can see in the way that Russia has simultaneously pursued the Battalion Tactical Group as a sort of small-scale, rapidly mobilizable force for local operations, while simultaneously trying to bring back divisional structuring, in that they have the Russian ground Force in particular are having to consider setting up both for small-scale local operations, but also for a larger-scale peer-on-peer fight. And that divisional structure is mainly geared towards the latter and not the former. If you look where Russia has cited its re-established divisions, it's two on the Ukrainian border, one on the Belarusian border, 2 in reserve around Moscow, 1 in Central Reserve in the Central Military Theatre, 1 on the Georgian border down in Chechnya, and 1 on the Chinese border around Vladivostok. So there is a kind of a tie between the return to divisional capability and the return of a peer-on-peer possibility that requires greater numbers of assets, greater command and control over those assets, and a greater ability to sustain those assets for those kind of fights, of the kind of things we haven't seen in the Syria conflict for good reason. James, who wants to add anything to that?
Thanks, Henry. James, why don't you
Thanks, Henry. Thanks, Bastian. I think it's worth noting that the reintroduction of divisional formations doesn't mean that they're getting rid of brigades or getting rid of BTGs, as Henry pointed out. It's more just the combat contingencies that the forces have been faced with, forced them to reassess the more wholesale move that had gone on before. I think it's interesting that when these, the first couple of divisional level reactivations took place before Ukraine, admittedly, but the principal series took place after that. And some analysts, this is discussed in the dossier, have said that the established forces that were set up around Ukraine found it difficult to manage incoming battalion tactical troops. So divisional level coordination assets were useful for Russia, but with the renewed appreciation of the potential for high intensity war, I think the application of these higher level coordinating functions that you get in divisional level assets and organizations is useful for bringing to bear higher level military capabilities in combat support, so artillery, and combat service support that aren't necessarily previously held in those sort of more mobile brigade units. So I think it's not necessarily reducing flexibility on new operations, but it's increasing their ability to conduct a war that until 2014, potential war until 2014, Russia had not necessarily shaped its forces to achieve.
Thank you very much. Thank you for both of those answers. Moving on to a question on Russian Arctic activities. So I'm going to call on Nick Childs next to perhaps pick that one up. Marisa Lino, she's normally based in the US. I'm not sure where she is now, but I assume in the US, is asking where Russia's icebreakers fit into the overall picture. One might add, where do cruise missiles and icebreakers fit in? But Nick, would you like to perhaps speak a little bit about Russian Arctic activities, and then I'm looking if anybody else would like to come in on that. But Nick, why don't you start on this one?
Thank you, Bastian, and thank you, Marisa, for the question. Clearly, the Arctic and the High North is an important priority area as far as Russia is concerned in terms of a whole range of issues, not least the economic prospects for the future. And in that context, clearly Russian icebreakers are an important enabling capability in supporting operations there, both in terms of, as you suggest, developing capabilities as far as basing is concerned, but in the broader context of the maritime context of a dramatically changing environment there. And I think it's important in this context to also see the maritime context, particularly of the High North, it is formed of a number of elements, and amongst those elements are the potential, economic development and exploitation of sea routes, and particularly a northern sea route that is in the offing for the future, and Russian icebreaking capabilities are significant in that respect. But also, one must also reflect that as far as the High North is concerned, key elements to that is not just what happens in the High North, but what develops out of the High North, and the ability to have basing that allows a secure access from the Arctic out into what are, as far as the Russian strategy is concerned, key priority areas out into the broader Atlantic and beyond. That is also an important aspect of that. As Bastian alluded to the issue of icebreakers and cruise missiles, and it is a significant element of the calibrization that I discussed earlier. That one at least of the potential developments that has at least been put out there as a possibility is, at least as far as ice-capable future patrol ships are concerned, the prospect has been raised that they too could be fitted with some form of containerized cruise missile capability, and that would be a further intriguing aspect of the further development of that offensive capability and options available with that offensive capability going forward.
Thank you, Nick. I'd like now to ask James and Henry to perhaps also add a few points on this, on the matter of High North and Arctic. James, and then Henry. James.
Very briefly, thanks, Bastian. I think this has gathered renewed attention over the last sort of 6 months with the announcement that in early 2021, the Northern Fleet will become its own military district, which is a move perhaps designed to reduce the bureaucratic burdens on command and control relating to perhaps land forces in that area. But I think it's worth pointing out that Russia has for many years professed an ambition to increase its force structure and reinvigorate its previous infrastructure in the High North, in the Arctic. It's deployed specific equipment sets there, such as the gas turbine T-80 BVM, I think is positioned based up in that region. And we've seen a lot of sort of messaging in some of the parades of liveried vehicles in Arctic, we could say, camouflage formations. But I think it's worth pointing out that it's proven very difficult to generate new bases and renewed infrastructure in this region. As I said, it's been an aspiration for a number of years, but it still in many cases remains an aspiration. And that points to the environmental difficulties that Russia faces in that region. It's very difficult to operate in.
Thank you, James. Henry.
Just to echo a little bit of what James said, I think there are two points just to add on to from what Nick and James already said, one of which is just a reflection that the Arctic ambition is long-standing. It kind of has to take a bit of a backseat in the latter half of the SAP as other areas of Russia's border take precedence, the Ukraine and elsewhere. But it's not gone away, and the ambition to build capability there continues. I think we're seeing a kind of a natural swing back towards the long-held ambition in the last few months as resourcing comes available for it. But James's point should be, I think, on the difficulty of doing so, even with attention. Just climatically, it's just it's one of the most challenging places to build and sustain military operations. The point to reflect on the Arctic as well generally is it's the opening up of the Arctic is both an economic opportunity for Russia, but a potential security vulnerability. I think the Russians have traditionally have been very reluctant to leave any area of Russia vulnerable in security terms if they can possibly avoid it. And I think that underscores some of their continuing attention on the Arctic outside of the traditional kind of nuclear role the kind of the High North have played from the Cold War in terms of icebreaker and presence operations and sustaining an increased air defense picture up there as well.
Henry, thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to a question from Byron Callan, also in the US, and he has asked about our thoughts and insights on Russian cooperation with China and India with regards to defense exports and weapons development. I'm going to ask Douglas to kick us off on this one, but then also looking to other colleagues to chip in after. Douglas, perhaps a few thoughts on where China and India might be looking to Russian technology and access to exports in particular. Douglas.
Thanks, Bastian. Thanks for the question, Byron. I think from a Russian perspective, China and India pose different challenges in terms of the export market. The broader Chinese-Russian relationship seems to be one of strategic convenience. In the 1990s, Russia provided China with access to a whole range of aerospace technologies, most of which China is at least as capable, if not arguably more capable in now, with a couple of exceptions. Aero engines probably being one of them, perhaps ballistic missile defence, and we still see cooperation in those areas. India is a slightly different challenge in the sense that it's still a market Russia has a genuine opportunity to sell into, unlike China, which is a much more challenging market for them now. The problem with the Indian market is obviously there are other countries there, not least of all the US, offering in significant platforms and capabilities. Where you may see things play out in India is that Russia will be viewed as a source for technologies that either the Western power, the US in particular, is unwilling to release for a range of sensitivities. In terms of where the technology developments might go, particularly with China, I think it's interesting that there is actually the potential to see the flow in reverse now from China to Russia rather than Russia to China in certain areas. The Russians still seem to struggle with developing imaging infrared seekers for next generation air-to-air weapons. This doesn't seem to be a problem at all for China. The PL-10 is a very, very capable weapon. And also in terms of active electronically scanned array radar technology, the Russians again seem to be struggling, at least in terms of manufacture at numbers for a number of platforms. Again, we haven't seen any of that kind of problem in China as far as we know. So you do wonder if Moscow can slightly swallow its pride, whether or not it might benefit from actually saying to the Chinese, let's cooperate, let's co-develop in some of these areas, even if it's actually just a Chinese product badged with Cyrillic on the side. Thank you.
Douglas, thank you very much. And I'd like to ask also Fenella to comment on this question. Fenella, please.
Thanks, Bastian. So I think with Russian exports, the issue is that they're so crucial for Russian defence industry, perhaps more so than in, say, Western markets, just for funding defence industrial development, modernisation, and future programmes in order to bolster those modernisation targets and efforts. So that, in a way, leads to a ring fencing or a protection of Russian exports. And there is that sense of that Russia might be better in terms of industrial participation offering and partnerships, technology transfer. But the evidence is fairly weak on that. It's more foreign favourable exchange rates, foreign loan agreements, and those aspects of contracts that tend to encourage Russian exports globally. But that said, going forward, again, as I highlighted, they are facing huge headwinds with the trying to remain competitive on the global market. So it's a bit of a difficult situation that they find themselves in. So there may be that greater impetus towards partnerships, particularly with China and India, on programs going forward in order to maintain their competitiveness and ensure that export revenue still comes through. Otherwise, we may get to a point where Russian defense industry, with this high level of debt, isn't able to continue this modernization or even return to it after this period of sustainment. So in the longer term, I think we might then see a move towards this more partnerships globally. But I think it will be quite slow, and it will take quite a significant shift in mentality in order to see a marked difference. Thank you.
Fenella, thank you very much. I'm going to ask Henry to also comment on this one. Before we do that, I'm going to prime my colleagues here that next we will turn to Peter Hudson's question on how good the Russians are now at jointery. I'm going to ask James to kick that one off. So I'm going to put out the activation order here. But before we go there, Henry, also on Russia, China, India exports and technology dependencies. Henry.
Yeah, just a quick follow up on some of Doug's points on China. I think that he's indeed correct. I think you're more likely to see the flow in the other direction in the near future. I think if you look at the three major headline Russian exports to China on the defense field. You put aero engines to a side as understanding. There hasn't been a follow up Su-35 contract signed. The level of interest in that seems to have waned somewhat. I think there are those who suggested in the initial contract that really the interest there might have been seeing how Chinese equivalent stacked up against it and giving the Chinese a good sense of where they were and how much they should invest in continuing their own efforts in this field were probably correct. And I think that the conclusion is probably the Chinese think they can do something reasonably equivalent without too much hassle rather than going back to Russia for that. I think S-400 is probably going to fit into the same category. The latest long-range Chinese indigenous SAM HQ-9B seems to be roughly on the equivalent capability to the last model Russian indigenous S-300 modification, the PM2. So China doesn't look like it's that far behind on long-range air defense, while the S-400 is still an improvement. I suspect there is a body of thought in Beijing that, having looked at what the Russians can do with this, that Chinese think that given a reasonable amount of time, they can catch up to this level as well. I think it's not so much. I don't intend this to be a knock on the level of Russian capability in these areas. I think it's more a reflection of how far China has managed to come in the last 2 decades in their own modernization efforts. The level of lead Moscow has on China in some of these areas has narrowed or been surpassed, and that the systems and projects they have left that China might be interested in are behind the kind of strategic red line that Moscow has so far been unwilling to cross in terms of China.
Henry, thank you very much. So we'll now turn to the question on what the panel thinks about the Russian proficiency in the delivery of what Peter Hudson has called here genuinely joint and integrated operations. So how much progress has Russia made in that particular area, or are they still effectively environmentally structured? James, why don't you begin, and then I'm looking to other colleagues who would like to come in on this, but James, why don't you start?
Thanks, Bastian. I think the broad answer is a work in progress. Syria is a useful test of Russia's ambitions in this area, and Russia certainly does have ambitions in this area to improve joint coordination. Syria is run by the Syria operation is run through the National Defense Management Center in Moscow. That was built in 2014 in order to act as a wartime command and control center. And it's seen visibly in the briefings also that it's holding that function. Allied to this is the introduction of more unified command and control systems throughout the armed forces, devolved to lower unit levels, designed to improve situational awareness and then link this more common picture back up to higher command. That, of course, is then allied with the truncation of the command and control machinery that we saw and we discussed earlier on. When Russia tried to do this sort of stuff, removing layers of command back in 2007, 2008, before the New Look reforms, they saw that actually they were just introducing another layer of complexity into the structures. So shortening this decision-making process has been also a key aspiration of the move to joint strategic commands and the reduction in levels of command that orders have to pass through. But if Syria is the test, it's important to note that it's a relatively small test. Russia's also conducting tests of these forces, these concepts, these systems in its large scale, very large scale in many cases, exercises. But when it comes to Syria, it's worth bearing in mind that, as I said, it's a relatively small scale operation still. It doesn't involve large numbers of ground forces, doesn't involve large scale maneuver warfare of the sort that would generate the friction that these systems would be intended to overcome in an operational context rather. So they're trying to do it, but they haven't really faced the test of a real operation yet. But certainly the aspiration is there. And with that, I'll hand over to my colleagues.
Thank you, James. We'll go to Douglas next.
Thanks, Bastian. Just a couple of brief comments, and simply to echo what James says about this being an ongoing development. I think we've got to keep in mind, and I'm sure Peter has this in his question as well, in the sense that there's a risk that we can expect mirroring here, or we fall into a mirroring trap, and we think that the Russians should do exactly the same as the West. They won't do that, partly because the systems they have, both structurally and in terms of technology, don't lead them down that path. They'll find a way to do it, and they'll find workarounds which will be effective in their terms potentially. I think the other thing to think about is that they're spending an enormous amount of time and effort on figuring out, if you like, how to disintegrate other people's approaches. The amount of effort that's gone into electronic warfare in terms of renewed investment, trying to disrupt how other peer competitors might go about this, I think it is fundamental to them. And I think that they will have more of a, if you like, a belt and braces approach to this than perhaps the West, in the sense that they will be less reliant on lightning bolts on PDFs screens to suggest how your connectivity all works.
Douglas, thank you very much. We'll turn to Nick and then to Henry.
Thank you, Bastian. Thank you, Peter. Just a brief add-on footnote, I suppose, on the naval front. That clearly one has seen in particularly the significant naval activities as far as exercises are concerned in recent times, that it has been a key element of the approach to those to try and integrate more the naval capabilities into other, and particularly aerospace capabilities, not least because the near seas defense in depth green water capabilities that I was talking about earlier crucially depend for their effectiveness and their abilities to be sustained on that ability to operate effectively within and underneath that umbrella of other capabilities. So that is and has been a growing focus as far as the main exercise routines have been concerned, as well as other things like swing integration between fleets as part of a process within naval capabilities. But as I think my colleagues have suggested, yes, it is a work in progress. And in terms, particularly in the maritime environment, the real test is yet to come.
Thank you, Nick. Henry, please.
Just echoing Doug's point about the counterfactual, the Russian investment in disruption and the Russian approach, clearly anticipating sort of peer-on-peer contests being very difficult to exercise joint control in general, and that the idea being able to actually Russia's advantages in being able to improvise something out of nothing, as opposed to having an incredibly connected swish point together under optimum conditions system that is not going to be available to them when the crunch comes anyway. I think there are, in some ways, you can telling signs of how, both James's point about Syria, that how many operational commanders have done a tour in Syria to come back to higher command. So how much experience there is, even if it's a limited operation, of having conducted a real world test of this. But also the Russian willingness occasionally to cross-post people between services. The head of the Air Force is an Army man, or Ground Forces man by background. This is the kind of thing I point to Western Armed Force where that gets to happen more often than not. I think there are a kind of a pragmatic flexibility in Russia that I think they see themselves as serving well in these kind of operations, plus an expectation that, if jointery breaks down on both sides, particularly in the ground domain, that Russia sees themselves having serious advantages there in that kind of fight.
Henry, thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to points that Alexei Imofeyev raised, and I'm going to first perhaps ask the project leads for this, who are James and Douglas, to perhaps speak a little bit about the boundaries of what we covered and what we didn't cover, because Alexei raised a question around border guards and the National Guard. And then he also raised a particular question on a Typhoon class boat, and I wonder whether I can, for that, turn to Nick and Henry to say something about. But perhaps James and Douglas to start on where we have drawn the boundaries of our inquiry. I don't know who wants to start between the two of you. James, do you want to? Yeah, you moved first, so you get the privilege.
Thank you, Bastian. Within this report, we were very clear in our approach to it that we were focusing directly on the armed forces. That's why we've got analysis on land, sea, air. Within land, we also cover VDV and some of the special forces elements. So we reflect the broader units, Coast Guard, Coastal Defence Forces and National Guard throughout parts of the book, but we don't devote specific sections to them. Where we do discuss the National Guard is in a piece about Russia's conception of what conflict may be in future, where we frame the existence of National Guard and its creation as reflecting the sort of a view of the blurred lines between peace and war, the blurring between front lines and rear areas that Russian conceptions of conflict can be seen to reflect. And the National Guard, because of that, brings together interior troops and other formations, and its remit ranges from civil disobedience management to protection of strategic sites. So it reflects that national security focus that you see in the recent developments organizationally within Russia as well. So we do reflect it, but we don't devote specific attention to it. But what I would say is that you also mentioned in your question, Alexei, airborne forces, and we do devote some attention to the VDV, and it's worth just pointing out that although in the New Look reforms of 2008, there were initial plans to slash the VDV, to reduce them by half. They ended up being the formation, perhaps along with strategic rocket forces, perhaps least affected. They retained their divisional formations. Why? Possibly the shortage of transport aircraft. That was one of the reasons why there may have been the suggestion that they be reduced in size, but also an uncertainty over their role in the post-Cold War era. Why did they survive? Perhaps bureaucratic political reasons, but also perhaps because they were always the force that was intended to be held at higher readiness and perhaps more mobile than other forces that were slated for reduction. But even now, our analysis in the dossier points to the conceptual issues around VDV's future role that were discussed back in 2008 and are still being discussed now. For instance, what's the future of the parachute role? VDV, like the Army, is experimenting with air mobile forces in recent years, and they're also getting heavier armor, perhaps to improve complementarity with the Army. They've benefited from reinvestment in recent years under the 2020 SAP, but there's still some uncertainty over what their precise role will be moving forward. Douglas, I'll hand over to you.
Obviously, again, echo what James said. I mean, you have to draw a line somewhere, however arbitrary. And we kind of settled on what we thought were the core services and core capabilities. Obviously, there are a number of other areas we could have pursued, but when you get to about 200 pages, you begin to think the publications department might start to get a bit unhappy.
Thank you both. So turning to, I'm not quite sure what prompted Alexei's question in particular on the Dmitry Donskoy. But Nick or Henry, do you want to? Yeah, Henry, and then Nick. Okay.
All right. Just back to I think it's from the table in strategic forces section, whether or not the Dmitry Donskoy deserves to be included there. I think you can make a case both ways, but as far as reflecting a judgment, but it's both in the military modernization dossier, but also in the military balance publication annually. I think you basically touch upon the answer in your question that the primary role of Dmitry Donskoy at the moment is SLBM testing, and I don't expect her to be performing regular SSBN tasking except in the direst of emergency circumstances. I don't think Russia has displayed a particular interest in keeping large numbers of the Typhoon class, Akula class in service for very long, and Dmitry Donskoy is the last survivor. Appears to be sort of relegated to a secondary role at this point, and not despite nominally still being part of the active fleet, we wouldn't consider her as an active SSBN capability at this point in time.
Thank you, Henry. Nick, and also an invitation to say anything else you want to say about Russian submarines while we're on it.
Thank you. I mean, I think Henry has summed it up pretty well in terms of the table that was referenced. Clearly, that was as far as we assess it to be, those submarines active in that primary role of sea-based nuclear strategic force capability, which is, perhaps it is a role where specifically the continued operation of that kind of capability is key as far as the individual units is concerned. And yes, our judgment has been that the Typhoon class in recent times has clearly had as its primary function that role as a testbed, essentially, capability, and we assess it as that and record it as that in our data and elsewhere in the dossier. Having said that, certainly in terms of the future trajectory of the SSBN capability, as I discussed, it is in maritime terms one area where there will be perhaps some of the most significant change and transformation as far as a generational new capability is concerned in the time ahead, precisely because it is absolutely a priority program as far as delivery is concerned, as far as the maritime capabilities of Russia are concerned, and certainly particularly in the context of perhaps the Northern Fleet itself. It is to some extent the raison d'etre of a large part of that fleet is in terms of supporting that SSBN nuclear strategic force capability, including the role of submarines, the other submarine capabilities that are deployed. Precisely how that function is developed over time, it remains a matter of debate in terms of things like the development of the Bastion concept in order to protect the SSBN fleet, the future scenarios in which the other submarine capabilities are deployed either close at hand to support the SSBN force or perhaps in a broader context, and therefore how a dynamic beyond even forward defense of a Bastion area into how a submarine would be employed in the context, for example, of operations in the Atlantic remains, I think, a moot point, because although across the range of generational capabilities that exist, particularly in the Northern Fleet, as far as submarines are concerned, there is a considerable capability there. But going back to the point of the dossier in many other respects, while there is a significant capability there, the numbers are not there in the way they were in previous generations, and that is an important consideration for Russia in terms of its deployment, even of such a capability.
Nick, thank you very much. While we're on issues that haven't really come up yet, one is, of course, cyber. Perhaps one of the reasons is, from our side, that we later this year will be publishing a dossier specifically on cyber capabilities, where we assess a whole range of countries, including Russia. So you will hear from us more on this particular issue, but perhaps we can, despite the forthcoming publication of that particular cyber dossier, we can at least briefly touch upon cyber capability here as well. If I can turn to James to perhaps say a few words on Russia and cyber. James.
Thank you, Bastian. I mean, where we do cover this issue in the dossier is around Russia's view of information and influence tools. And we discuss cyber within that context as one of the means that Russia can use, along with more traditional tools of generating influence and exerting influence and propagating information activities. So we discuss it within that context, and as we talked about earlier on, we discuss in a couple of places in the dossier this conception of blurred lines between peace and war, and that demands a whole of government approach that involves formations, information operations troops, which are believed to include, they were formed in 2017, believed to include cyber operations among their mission set, and also the broader range of civilian organizations that will be engaged in cyber-related activities. What we do talk about is as I said, the information influence tools. These have always been of importance. There's not necessarily that there's been a particular resurgence. It's more that there's been an awareness that there are new tools through which to deliver capabilities that Russia, like many other states, has often seen it useful to try and exert in civilian spaces and also across the battlefield. What we do then go on to discuss, and I'd commend this section to the reader when they read the dossier, is that we discuss that either these tools or the military instrument doesn't present Russia with a binary choice. More that Russia can see, and it could be conceived in this way, that sees a continuum of capabilities, a capability continuum rather than a set of binary choices. One can be used in whatever contingency that Russia sees their utility in. And I think overly focusing on, for instance, cyber tools or information influence tools, without focus also on the generation of hard military power, misses something really in the Russian conception of the use of military force. While after 2000 and certainly after 2014, there were some discussions about whether conflicts could be won with minimal use of force. I think recent speeches over the last 2 years have again re-emphasized almost the primacy of conventional military capabilities within Russia. Some of the speeches by CGS Gerasimov, for instance, go to this, speak to this issue at its heart. So I think it's important to bear in mind that although we do talk about information, influence, cyber, and the range of other civilian state capabilities within the dossier in certain terms within the frame that Douglas and I just discussed earlier, it's important to bear in mind, I think, that these constitute a capability suite for Russia rather than a preferred set of options at any one point.
James, thank you very much. We're drawing to a close, but I want to ask Fenella to pick up a point that she mentioned in her part of the presentation, as some people might wonder how Russia, with in the bigger scheme of things, comparatively modest total expenditure in US dollar terms, can afford quite as much bang for the buck. And Fenella already spoke about the difference between core budget and total defense expenditure, but perhaps it's worth to put it also into context of Triple P, and given that Russia is one of the countries where one can actually usefully think in Triple P terms. Fenella, maybe you can color that out a little bit more, what the Russian spending effort looks like in that, if you look at that measure. Fenella.
Sure, thanks, Bastian. So if we, as you say, Russia is one of those countries where it is relevant because so much kit is indigenously produced. There's no reliance on US imports for defense material. So if you did adopt the PPP conversion rate, you'd see a Russian defense budget closer to $120–130 billion, up from around the 50 that it is. Similarly, China would be mid 300s compared to the 200 that it's estimated to be at market exchange rates. So therefore, you would have Russia obviously higher up in the league tables and the rankings and whatnot. But while it's appropriate for China and Russia, it's less suitable if you assess countries like India and Saudi Arabia, where there is that reliance on imports from the US. For those countries, you'd have to adopt some sort of hybrid approach where your personnel and O&M part of the budget is converted using market exchange rates, while investment is where the former is using the PPV rate and the latter is using the market exchange rate because of that reliance on US exports. The other aspect to consider is that with the Russian defense budget, there is that orientation towards modernization more so than there is in Western markets, perhaps. So up to 40% of the budget is dedicated to procurement and R&D, where in, say, European NATO markets, you're looking at closer to 20 to 25%. So that reorientation of the budget also enables that stark increase in capabilities and modernization efforts at a faster pace, just because more of the budget is dedicated towards it. Thank you.
Fenella, thank you very much. I think that's an important point to add for overall understanding of this subject matter. Thank you all for joining us today for this launch of the IISS strategic dossier, Russia's military modernization and assessment. It was a pleasure to have you. It was a pleasure to discuss these matters with you. I hope you'll have an opportunity to read the full dossier. It is available now in PDF and hard copy, a very good looking hard copy, I might add. We hope to see you soon at one of these webinars in the next couple of days and weeks. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much for your time, and bye-bye for now.